The dust swirled across the barren street like a warning as Eleanor Frost stepped off the stagecoach, her emerald eyes squinting against the harsh Montana sun. Fargo wasn't much to look at, just a handful of buildings scattered along the main thoroughfare like forgotten chess pieces on an abandoned board. But it was her last hope after fleeing Boston with nothing but a carpetbag and shattered dreams. "Madam, you might want to step aside," the driver called, already unloading trunks from the roof, "unless you're fixing to get crushed by someone's worldly possessions." Eleanor moved quickly, clutching her bag to her chest. The year was 1875, and the West was still wild, especially for a woman alone. She'd heard stories of Fargo, Montana, a mining town that had sprung up 5 years prior when silver was discovered in the nearby hills. Now it teemed with prospectors, merchants, and those looking to make their fortune any way they could. The journey from Boston had been grueling, but necessary. Her father's gambling debts had left her with no choice but to flee the creditors who'd threatened to collect their due by any means necessary. Teaching was her only marketable skill, and when she'd spotted the advertisement seeking a schoolteacher for Fargo, she'd seized the opportunity. "You must be Miss Frost," a portly man called, hurrying across the street. His suit was well made but dusty, his mustache neatly trimmed. "I'm Mayor Pullman. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "The stage made better time than anticipated," Eleanor replied, offering her hand. "I'm eager to begin my duties, Mr. Mayor." "Excellent, excellent. The school's been vacant since Miss Watkins eloped with that drummer passing through last spring. The children have been running wild." He glanced nervously at her carpetbag. "Is that all your luggage, Miss Frost?" "I travel light," she said simply. "Well then, I'll show you to your accommodations. You'll be staying at Mrs. Huxley's boarding house. Respectable establishment." He reached for her bag, but Eleanor clutched it tighter. "Thank you, but I can manage." As they walked, Pullman pointed out the various businesses: the mercantile, the assayer's office, the bank. Eleanor nodded politely, her attention caught by the saloon on the corner, where piano music spilled onto the street along with raucous laughter. "That's the Silver Dollar," Pullman said disapprovingly. "Best to avoid such establishments, Miss Frost." Eleanor had no intention of frequenting saloons, but his presumption grated. Before she could respond, the saloon doors burst open. 2 men tumbled into the street, fists flying, while others gathered to watch the fight. Among the spectators stood a tall man who seemed apart from the chaos, despite being in its midst. Unlike the others, he wore no expression of excitement or bloodlust, just cool detachment as he observed the brawl. His black hat shadowed his features, but Eleanor could see the sharp line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders beneath a worn duster coat. A gun belt hung low on his hips. "Who is that?" she asked before she could stop herself. Pullman followed her gaze and frowned. "That's Matthew Vance, town marshal, though he's more trouble than he's worth most days. Former outlaw, if rumors are to be believed. Man barely speaks 10 words a week." Eleanor watched as Marshal Vance finally stepped forward, grabbing both fighters by their collars with surprising speed and strength. He knocked their heads together with a dull thud, then dropped them unceremoniously in the dirt. "Take it inside or take it to jail," he said, his voice carrying across the street. It was deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. The crowd dispersed, the fighters staggering back into the saloon. The marshal turned, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Eleanor's across the distance. Something electric passed between them, a recognition of sorts that made no sense. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a barely perceptible nod before turning away. "As I was saying," Pullman continued, oblivious to the exchange, "Mrs. Huxley runs a tight ship. No gentlemen callers, no alcohol, and lights out by 10. Perfect for a schoolteacher." Eleanor tore her gaze away from the marshal's retreating figure. "Yes, I'm sure it will be suitable." Mrs. Huxley proved to be a stern widow with steel-gray hair and a perpetual frown. She showed Eleanor to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, explaining the house rules in clipped tones. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. You'll be responsible for your own midday meal. Bathing is Saturday evenings only. No exceptions. I understand, Eleanor said, placing her bag on the narrow bed. When might I see the schoolhouse? Tomorrow will have to do. It's nearly supper time now. Mrs. Huxley hesitated at the door. Word of advice, Miss Frost, this town isn't Boston. Men outnumber women 5-1. Keep your wits about you. Eleanor nodded. I always do. After an austere meal with Mrs. Huxley and her two other boarders, a clerk from the mercantile and an elderly woman who spoke only to her lap, Eleanor retreated to her room. She unpacked her meager belongings. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a hairbrush, and a small leather-bound journal. At the bottom of her bag lay the real reason she'd fled Boston, a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon. Evidence of a love affair that had ended in betrayal and scandal. Richard had been engaged to another the entire time, a fact he'd neglected to mention until his fiancée's father threatened to cut him off without a penny if he didn't end things with Eleanor immediately. Her father's gambling debts had merely provided a convenient excuse to leave after the humiliation. Eleanor tucked the letters into the drawer of the small bedside table. She would burn them soon. Sleep eluded her that night, the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town keeping her alert. Sometime after midnight, gunshots rang out, followed by shouts. Eleanor rose from bed and peered out the window in time to see Marshal Vance marching a man down the street, one hand gripping the back of the drunk's collar. Even from her window, she could see the set of the marshal's shoulders tense, alone, keeping the world at a distance. She watched until they disappeared from view, wondering what had made a man so closed off. The schoolhouse was a small clapboard building at the edge of town. Mayor Pullman met Eleanor there the next morning, keys in hand. The interior was dusty, the desks in disarray, but it held potential. School term starts Monday, Pullman said. You've got 3 days to prepare. We've got about 20 children of school age, though attendance is irregular. I'll change that, Eleanor promised. She'd already decided that routine and discipline would be her allies in this strange new place. Pullman seemed doubtful but nodded. Supply list is on the desk. Whatever you need, put it on the town's account at the mercantile. After he left, Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She'd been cleaning for nearly an hour when the door creaked open. She turned, expecting Pullman again, but instead found Marshal Vance filling the doorway. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and hardship. His eyes were the color of a storm-tossed sea, and they studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Marshal," she acknowledged, straightening her spine. "Miss Frost." His voice was just as she remembered, deep and raw. "Mayor asked me to check on you. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine." She gestured to the half-cleaned room. He nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, he removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm hardly alone. The town is just down the street. Too far if trouble comes calling." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Mind if I take a look around?" Without waiting for her answer, he began a methodical inspection of the building, checking windows, the back door, the small cellar access. Eleanor watched, both irritated and intrigued by his presumption. "You always barge in and take charge, Marshal Vance." He paused, one hand on the window frame. "Only when I see someone who doesn't know the dangers they're facing. I assure you, I'm quite capable of taking care of myself." For the first time, something like amusement flickered in his eyes. "I'm sure you believe that, Miss Frost." "But this isn't Boston," her eyes narrowed. "You've been asking about me. It's my job to know who's in my town." He moved back to the door, settling his hat on his head. "Lock up when you leave. Don't stay after dark." "Is that an order, Marshal? It's advice. Take it or leave it." He reached for the door handle, then paused. "There's a shotgun in the closet. Previous teacher kept it loaded." With that, he was gone, leaving Eleanor staring at the door. Curiosity got the better of her and she checked the closet. Sure enough, a shotgun leaned against the wall, shells beside it. She wondered what kind of place she'd come to where schoolteachers needed firearms. Over the next few days, Eleanor threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse. She cleaned, arranged desks, and drew up lesson plans. She visited the mercantile for supplies, where she encountered curious stares from the townspeople. She saw Marshal Vance occasionally, making his rounds or breaking up the occasional dispute. He always acknowledged her with that same slight nod, never stopping to speak. Yet she often felt his eyes following her movements. On Sunday evening, Eleanor decided to take a walk along the creek that ran behind the town. The day had been hot, and the thought of cool water was too tempting to resist. She followed a narrow path, enjoying the relative quiet away from the bustle of Main Street. She'd been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when she rounded a bend and came upon a small clearing. There, kneeling by the water's edge, was Marshal Vance. He'd removed his hat, coat, and gun belt and was washing his face and arms in the creek. Eleanor froze, knowing she should retreat, but unable to tear her eyes away from the sight of him. Water droplets caught the evening light as they ran down his forearms, which were corded with muscle. A long scar traced from his shoulder down his right arm, visible through his damp shirt. A twig snapped beneath her foot. The marshal's reaction was instantaneous. He spun around, hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there. When he recognized her, his posture relaxed slightly, but his expression remained guarded. "Miss Frost, it's not safe for you to be wandering alone. So you keep saying, yet here I am, perfectly unharmed." She took a step forward. "I simply wanted some fresh air before school begins tomorrow." He reached for his hat and gun belt. "I'll walk you back." "That's not necessary, it is." His tone brooked no argument. They walked in silence for several minutes, Eleanor acutely aware of his presence beside her. He moved with a predator's grace, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You don't trust easily, do you, Marshal Vance?" she finally asked. He glanced at her briefly. "Trust is earned, and has anyone in Fargo earned yours?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "No." "That sounds like a lonely existence." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "It's easier to be alone." Something in his expression, a flash of old pain quickly hidden, touched her. "Then why are you still talking to me?" For a moment, surprise registered on his face, followed by something like reluctant admiration. Then the mask slipped back into place. "My job is to keep people safe. That includes stubborn schoolteachers who don't know any better than to wander around at dusk." They continued walking, the tension between them shifting into something Eleanor couldn't quite name. When they reached the edge of town, he stopped again. "School starts at 8, he asked. She nodded, surprised by the question. "I'll be there. First day can be rough." Before she could respond, he touched his hat brim and strode away, leaving her wondering about the man behind the badge who claimed solitude was preferable, yet couldn't seem to stay away from her. True to his word, Marshal Vance appeared outside the schoolhouse the next morning as children began to arrive. Some eyed him warily, while others greeted him with cautious respect. He stationed himself near the door, arms crossed, a silent sentinel. The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing rules. Eleanor was pleased to find that, despite their unruly appearance, most of the children were eager to learn. By dismissal time, she felt cautiously optimistic about her new position. As the last child disappeared down the path, she stepped onto the porch to find the marshal still there, leaning against a post. "You're still here," she observed, "said I would be." He straightened. "How'd it go?" "Better than expected. They're bright children." He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Most are miners' kids, tough life. Which makes education all the more important." She hesitated. "Thank you for staying, though I'm not sure what trouble you expected. Didn't expect any, but being prepared beats being sorry." He glanced toward town. "I should make my rounds, of course." Eleanor found herself oddly disappointed. "Good day, Marshal." He started to turn, then paused. "There's a social at the church on Friday, town tradition for the new teacher to attend." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to attend as well?" "Not much for socials." He settled his hat more firmly. "But I'll be around." With that cryptic statement, he left, his long strides carrying him quickly toward Main Street. Eleanor watched him go, realizing with a start that she was looking forward to seeing him again. The week passed quickly, each day bringing new challenges and small victories in the classroom. Eleanor began to learn the rhythms of the town, the personalities of her students, and the subtle dynamics at play. She saw Marshal Vance daily, usually from a distance as he patrolled the streets, though occasionally he would stop by the schoolhouse at dismissal time, ostensibly to ensure order. Friday evening arrived, and Eleanor dressed carefully in her best gown, a deep blue that brought out the green of her eyes. Mrs. Huxley had grudgingly offered to curl her hair, and the result was more flattering than Eleanor had expected. The church social was already in full swing when she arrived. Lanterns hung from trees, casting warm light over tables laden with food. A fiddle player and banjo player provided lively music, and several couples danced in a cleared area beside the church. Mayor Pullman immediately descended upon her, introducing her to what seemed like every resident of Fargo. Eleanor smiled and chatted, trying to remember names and connections, all the while scanning the edges of the gathering for a tall figure in a black hat. "He won't come," a woman's voice said beside her. Eleanor turned to find a lovely redhead watching her with knowing eyes. "Matthew never attends these things. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. Sarah Wilson, I run the cafe," she offered a gloved hand, "and you're looking for our marshal." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was merely taking in the gathering." Sarah's smile was kind but knowing. "He's been different since you arrived. Actually speaks in complete sentences occasionally." Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah's attention was claimed by another guest. Left alone, Eleanor decided to get some air away from the press of people. She walked toward the edge of the churchyard, where darkness gathered beneath the trees. "Thought teachers were supposed to be smarter than this," a familiar voice drawled from the shadows. Eleanor peered into the darkness. Marshal Vance. He stepped forward, the moonlight revealing his familiar form, though he'd exchanged his usual attire for a clean shirt and vest. His gun belt remained, however. "Wandering off alone again," he said, disapproval evident in his tone. "I'm still within sight of 50 people," Eleanor pointed out. "And apparently you're watching me as well. Someone has to." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell leather and pine soap. "You look nice, Miss Frost." The compliment, delivered in his gruff manner, warmed her more than it should have. "You clean up rather well yourself, Marshal." Something like embarrassment crossed his features. "Sarah's doing, said I should make an appearance." "Yet you're hiding in the shadows, observing, different thing entirely," Eleanor laughed softly. "Is that what you call it? I think you're avoiding dancing." His expression confirmed her suspicion. "Not much for dancing. Or perhaps you simply haven't found the right partner." The words escaped before she could consider their implications. His eyes darkened as they held hers. "Maybe not." The fiddle struck up a slower tune, the notes drifting through the evening air. Without consciously deciding to, Eleanor held out her hand. "Dance with me, Marshal." He stared at her outstretched hand as though it might bite. "Here, away from prying eyes, just one dance." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed his gun belt, hanging it on a low branch. His hand, when it took hers, was calloused but gentle. "I'll probably step on your feet," he warned, placing his other hand tentatively at her waist. "I'll risk it." She rested her free hand on his shoulder, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her palm. They began to move, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. For a man who claimed not to dance, Matthew Vance learned quickly, guiding her in small circles beneath the trees. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, watching. Good observer. His eyes never left her face. "Where'd you learn to be so fearless?" Eleanor thought about her flight from Boston, the scandal she'd left behind. "I'm not fearless, just determined not to show fear." "There's a difference." "All the difference in the world." She studied him as they moved. "What were you before you were a marshal?" His jaw tightened. "Nothing worth talking about." Mayor Pullman mentioned rumors of an outlaw past. Matthew's steps faltered slightly. People talk, doesn't make it true. But it is, isn't it? She pressed, curious despite herself. What made you change sides? The music was ending, but he didn't release her immediately. Got tired of running, tired of blood. His voice dropped lower. Man can only take so many lives before it hollows him out. The raw honesty in his words caught her off guard. Before she could respond, he stepped back, his hands falling away from her. I've said too much. He retrieved his gun belt. Should get you back to the social before people talk. Let them talk, Eleanor said. I've weathered worse scandals than dancing with a handsome marshal. His eyebrows rose at her choice of words. Handsome, is it? She refused to be embarrassed. You own a mirror, I presume. Something like a genuine smile touched his lips. You're not like any schoolteacher I've met, Eleanor Frost. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. Perhaps that's because I'm not just a schoolteacher, she replied. Just as you're not just a marshal. He studied her for a long moment. Walk with me, she nodded, and they set off away from the social, following a path that led toward the creek. They walked in companionable silence, the sounds of the gathering fading behind them. Why Fargo? He finally asked. Truth this time, not the story you told Pullman. Eleanor considered denial but found she wanted to be honest with him. I needed to disappear. A man in Boston, I thought he loved me. I was wrong. Matthew listened as she told him about Richard, the scandal that had nearly erupted, her father's debts that had provided the perfect excuse to flee. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. When she finished, he said simply, he was a fool. Perhaps I was the fool for believing him. Trusting someone doesn't make you a fool. Being unworthy of trust makes him one. They had reached the creek, the water a ribbon of silver in the moonlight. Eleanor stopped, turning to face him fully. Is that why you keep everyone at a distance? Because you've been betrayed? His expression shuddered. I keep my distance because people deserve better than what I've been. And who decides what you deserve, Matthew Vance? She stepped closer. The past is done. It's the choices we make now that matter. He shook his head. It's not that simple. It is if you allow it to be. She reached up, touching his face lightly. We've all done things we regret. He caught her hand, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. For a heartbeat, she thought he might push her away. Instead, he held her there, his thumb brushing over her pulse point. You shouldn't be here with me, he said, but made no move to release her. Yet here I am. She met his gaze steadily. Perhaps you're not the only one who's tired of being alone. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Matthew's eyes searched hers, looking for something deception, perhaps, or fear. Finding neither, he slowly drew her closer. I'm not good at this, he murmured. At what? Letting people in. Eleanor smiled. I've noticed. Then his lips were on hers, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as the kiss deepened. Eleanor's hands found their way to his shoulders, then into his hair, reveling in the connection she'd been craving since that first day. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since you stepped off that stagecoach. What took you so long? She teased, her heart pounding. Fear, he admitted. Not of outlaws or bullets, of this, of wanting something I might lose. Eleanor understood then his solitude wasn't a preference but a defense. We all risk loss when we care for someone. The alternative is feeling nothing at all. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You make it sound simple. It's not, but it's worth it. She leaned into his touch. At least I believe it can be. A sound from the direction of town, distant shouting, drew Matthew's attention. His posture changed instantly, alert and focused. Stay here, he ordered, already moving toward the sound. I'm coming with you. He looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded sharply. Stay behind me. They hurried back toward town, the shouting growing louder. As they rounded the corner onto Main Street, they saw the cause flames leaping from the roof of the Silver Dollar Saloon, bright against the night sky. Fire! Matthew broke into a run, Eleanor following as quickly as her skirts allowed. The town was already responding, men forming a bucket brigade from the well to the burning building. Women were hurrying children away from the danger. Anyone inside? Matthew shouted to the barkeeper who stood stunned in the street. Don't think so, wait, Lily, she was upstairs. Without hesitation, Matthew ran toward the burning building. Eleanor cried out, but he was already disappearing through the door, swallowed by smoke and flames. The next minutes were the longest of Eleanor's life. She joined the women organizing the children, keeping them back from the danger, all while her eyes remained fixed on the saloon entrance. The flames were spreading rapidly, the wooden structure acting like kindling. Just when she'd begun to fear the worst, Matthew emerged from the smoke, a young woman cradled in his arms. He staggered a few steps before collapsing to his knees, the woman still clutched against his chest. Eleanor rushed forward, reaching them as he laid the unconscious woman gently on the ground. "Is she alive?" Matthew rasped, his voice roughened by smoke. "Barely." The town doctor pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside the woman. Matthew tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Without thinking, Eleanor slipped under his arm, supporting his weight. "Let me help you," she said firmly. He didn't argue, letting her guide him to a bench in front of the mercantile. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt singed in places. He coughed violently, doubling over. "You need the doctor," Eleanor said, fear tightening her chest. "Others need him more." Matthew straightened with visible effort. "I'm fine." "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met," she said, tears threatening. He caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Had to come back. Someone was waiting for me." The simple statement, delivered through smoke-roughened lips, broke something open inside her. Eleanor wrapped her arms around him, heedless of the soot staining her blue dress, of the townspeople who might see. "Don't ever do that to me again," she whispered against his neck. His arms came around her, solid and real. "Yes, madam." The fire raged for another hour before they managed to contain it. The saloon was a total loss, but they'd prevented the flames from spreading to neighboring buildings. The young woman, Lily, was taken to the doctor's house with severe smoke inhalation, but was expected to survive. Dawn was breaking when the last embers were doused. Eleanor had remained by Matthew's side throughout, fetching water when he needed it, helping tend to minor injuries as the doctor was occupied with more serious cases. They sat together on the bench as the town slowly began to disperse, exhausted citizens returning to their homes to catch what sleep they could. "You should rest," Eleanor said, noting the weariness etched in Matthew's features. "Job's not done." He nodded toward the smoking ruins. "Need to make sure it wasn't set deliberately. That can wait a few hours." She placed her hand over his. "You can barely stay upright." He looked down at their joined hands. "Not used to someone worrying about me. Best get used to it," she replied firmly. "I don't plan to stop." His eyes, red-rimmed from smoke but still that striking gray-blue, met hers. "That mean you're staying in Fargo?" "I signed a 1-year contract." She smiled. "But I find myself increasingly interested in more permanent arrangements." Understanding dawned in his expression. "That's a dangerous thought, Eleanor. I come with complications." "So do I," she squeezed his hand. "We all have pasts, Matthew. The question is whether we want to share a future." He was quiet for a long moment. "Never thought I'd want that, a future with someone. Always figured it was easier to be alone. And now I'm thinking maybe there are things worth the risk." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, like stubborn schoolteachers who don't know when to keep their distance. Eleanor laughed softly. "Then perhaps it's fortunate you've found one who's determined to get closer." 6 months later, as spring returned to Fargo, Eleanor stood at the front of the church beside Matthew, exchanging vows before the entire town. Sarah Wilson had helped arrange flowers everywhere, and Mayor Pullman, looking pleased with himself for having hired the teacher who'd tamed their taciturn marshal, gave Eleanor away in her father's absence. Matthew's hand was steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. His eyes never left hers as he repeated words he'd already whispered to her in private moments, promises of fidelity, of protection, of a love that had ambushed them both when they least expected it. The town celebrated long into the night, but the newlyweds slipped away early to the small house Matthew had been building at the edge of town. It wasn't grand, just 2 rooms with a kitchen and a porch that faced the mountains, but as he carried her across the threshold, Eleanor knew she'd found home. Later, as they lay tangled in sheets and each other, Matthew traced the curve of her shoulder with gentle fingers. "Still think I'm wrong about it being easier to be alone." Eleanor propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the lamplight. The hard lines had softened over the months, the wariness in his eyes replaced by something warm and certain. "Completely wrong," she said, pressing a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "This is infinitely better." His arms tightened around her. "Can't argue with that logic, Mrs. Vance. Good, I do so hate to repeat myself." She settled against him, fitting perfectly into the space beside him that seemed made for her. Outside, Fargo continued its frontier existence. There would be more fires to fight, more troubles to face. But within the walls of their small home, Eleanor and Matthew had found something neither had believed possible: a refuge in each other, a place where the past could be acknowledged, but didn't define their future. "I love you," Matthew murmured against her hair, the words still new enough to hold a sense of wonder. Eleanor smiled, remembering their first dance beneath the trees, the way he'd claimed it was easier to be alone. How far they'd come since then. "I love you too," she whispered back. "And I always will."